Hi, hello everyone. Welcome to our appointment with Life Science. Today we have the great pleasure of having with us Dr. Peter Pongrácz, a senior researcher at the Department of Ethology in the University of Budapest. And Peter is not only a very talented and experienced researcher on dog behavior and cognition with more than 60 publications, but he is also a colleague of mine. And for me, he is also a very good friend. Hello, Peter. Thank
Hi,
you
Claudia.
for accepting our invitation.
Oh, it's a pleasure. I am really excited. I never did something like this live on the internet, so it's really exciting to me.
Good, good. And we have a very interesting project to, and I mean, not only, it's a project that is ongoing, but for which we already have some results. And it's a very exciting topic, both in research and in the applied field. So I think this is going to be super interesting for everybody who works with dogs and who has a dog at home. And this topic is self-awareness, which is a hot topic in science and also in regards to the human literature. So the first request that I have for you, Peter, is to explain it in simple words. So how can we explain what self-awareness is?
Okay, so I totally agree with you, Claudia, that it's a hot topic in behavioral sciences and psychology also, because it's, as we know, it's a very human capacity to be able to represent ourselves in our minds. What does it mean is that when we think about things, when we do things, we always include ourselves into this, both actions and thinking. So we basically know about ourselves and know how we look like, as we, of course, well aware of this, that we are quite keen of thinking about ourselves. And it's thought to be a very human capacity. And also it is very well researched that how this capacity develops in little children, because of course, it's very interesting to see that when human babies are just a couple of days old or a couple of weeks old, a couple of months old, what can they do what we adults can do? And for example, 1 or 2 years old children already have some kind of capacity of knowing about themselves. So for example, they know that which limb is there. So this is their feet, this is their hand, this is their head. And eventually they also recognize themselves in the mirror. Now, as I mentioned this word, that mirror, when I talk about self-awareness, let's say, to the students at the university, or I talk about it to a reporter, for example, that we are researching this kind of things in animals, then basically the first question from the audience is always like, and do dogs recognize themselves in the mirror? Because this is for everyone somehow the standard test, whether an animal looks in the mirror and then recognizes that that is himself in the mirror. Now, of course, as we know, some animals can do this, so they can recognize themselves in the mirror. Some animals, as probably the audience also noticed, when a cat or a dog looks in the mirror, it behaves something very differently, because they don't behave with the mirror image of themselves like they would know that it is them. But for example, they try to find that other cat or other dog behind the mirror. Or for example, they show some kind of aggressive or fearful behavior with the mirror image. So we know that the mirror test is not working in every animal species. Now, should we be sad about it? This is the big question. And this is what we are doing at the university now. And this is what Claudia is also participating in this project, that we think, and this is our main core thought in this project, that self-awareness is not only about whether an animal or a human recognizes his own image in the mirror, but self-awareness can be much more and much more complex than just recognizing how do we look like.
Yes, indeed. So well, what we are doing is basically studying this concept as a more complex trait, which is composed by some building blocks. And I know that so far we have tested representation of own action, representation of the own body, and a representation of the size of the body in dogs. So can you describe a little bit the ideas behind the experiments and how the experiments have been done?
Absolutely. So this is the key word what you taught, Claudia, that there are building blocks, not only in the animals, but also in us humans, what we use as little modules or parts of self-awareness. Because as we already talked about it, self-awareness is not only about how do we look like, but it's much more. For example, it can be very simple thing. How big we are, for example. If you think about it, it's a very useful capacity for any animal, which is a large-bodied animal and moves rather fast, to know that what is the size of their own body, because otherwise in any obstacle what they meet in the nature will be a new challenge to try whether they can, for example, fit between two tree, or let's say a dog when it goes around in the house, there is a chair, and if it is a big dog, it probably will not be fit under the chair or between the legs of the chair. Now, if the dog wouldn't know how big how big is itself, then in each case, when they meet with an obstacle, they would need to learn whether they can fit through or whether they cannot. Or they would have to have very hard skin because they would bounce back whenever they hit something. So the body size awareness is a component of the self-awareness. And how did we test it at the university? It was like we offered the participant dogs a door on the wall. And the owner or the experimenter, depending on the test, was on the other side of this wall and called the dog, come here, come here. Meanwhile, the dog was on the other side. Now, what we were looking for, whether the dogs approach this opening with a kind of awareness of whether they will fit through or not. Or in the other case, if they, for example, don't think about how big they are, then they would any time just approach this door and try to squeeze through on this. Now we were offering at first a big enough door for them, and then a smaller and a smaller. In the end, we offered them a such small door, which was not like a keyhole, of course, but it was already too small for the given size of the dog. And what we found, that the dogs basically, from quite a big distance, could decide whether they will fit through this opening or not. And they approached only hesitantly and slowly the too small opening on the wall. And what is important, that these experimental equipment and these little doors for them, it was absolutely new for these dogs, which means that they could not learn ahead that, oh, I know that I will fit through it. So body size awareness is a very basic component of the self-awareness, but a very important one, because it makes it easier for the animal or for the human to work and operate freely in an environment where there can be physical obstacles.
That's super interesting, Peter. Thank you for the explanation. It reminds me of a movie that I saw when I was a kid, and where I remember that there was a Great Dane that was raised with smaller dogs. And in the movie, they would show that it seemed like the Great Dane wasn't aware at all of its own size. And this shows that the movie was rather a fiction, I would say. So that it is interesting.
Of course.
Yes. And so I would say, yes. And I would say in general. So we seem to not have any evidence of dogs being able to, or taking care of recognizing themselves in a mirror. We have no data about that at all. And we know that in science, you know, when we have a negative results, maybe somebody tried to test mirror self-recognition in dog and they obtained negative results. But in science, publishing negative results is really a challenge. So maybe somebody tried and obtained the negative results and couldn't publish it. And this is something we don't know. But what we know is that at the moment, there is no evidence of dogs being able to recognize themselves in the mirror. However, the studies we are carrying out in the framework of this project are giving us a better idea of how dogs may represent the self. And as you pointed out a little earlier, I think that it is important to point out that for dogs, you know, looking at themselves in a mirror might not be as interesting as for a human, because in the ecology of the dog, the physical, aesthetical aspect might not be as important as it is for us. Maybe I spend, you know, my 5 minutes putting on my makeup in the mirror, but this is more important for me as a woman if I want to find a partner, if I want to reproduce, and so on. But probably it could be not the same for dogs. However, Peter has shown us now that dogs, for example, represent their own size, and we have seen that they represent their own actions in another part of the study. So in general, what do you, Peter, think that these results, what we obtained so far, tell us about dog cognition in the framework of self-representation?
It's a very important thing, I think, what we are doing on self-awareness, self-representation in dogs, because as I am an ethologist, and as you know, ethology is about the natural behavior of the animals. Meanwhile, comparative psychology is a science which is more about, let's say, the main common principles of learning or cognition. But for an ethologist, the most important question is that the given species, let's say the dogs, capacity and behavior, capacity of thinking, capacity for cognition, how these features help the animal to survive and to behave on an adaptive way in the natural environment. And what we found about self-awareness so far, like the body awareness, the body size awareness, or what you did, Claudia, with the representing of own actions in the past, this all features of the dog cognition, which is very important for the dog. So I love these results because this shows that dog cognition, what the dogs can think about it, how is it connected to their success in the environment. And this is not something very abstract capacity. So let's say somebody is doing an experiment, or can dogs count, for example. And it is a very abstract capacity to be able to count. And right now, I could not tell what is the good for a dog if the dog would be able to count. But I can see that what is it good for the dog if it knows how big is he, or if it remembers what he was doing yesterday. It's very important for the animal. And this is why I think these building blocks of self-awareness can be regarded as ecologically and evolutionary very important for the dog. And on the broader sense, if we think about the dog as a model organism, it shows us that we should look for probably the simpler components of self-awareness even in other species, which we don't think so necessarily that, oh, they are so smart or they do many tricks, but they are rather simpler animals, but they can have components of self-awareness too.
Yeah, I totally agree. So basically, we can say that probably many or some of these building blocks evolved rather early in species that are now phylogenetically distant from humans, and in humans they have evolved, and now they are interlocked, and they sort of compose a fully fledged and complex sense of the self like we have. And there was a comment by Daniela. Hi, hello Daniela. I'll read it so you can maybe comment on it better. So she's greeting us from Mexico, and she says, it's a big difference between the perception of your body and movements with recognizing your image. I think she says between. So there's a difference between the perception of your body and movements and recognizing your image.
Absolutely. Absolutely, I agree, because as you, Claudia, already told, it was a very good example, actually, with the makeup and how important is the self-image for a person. In most species, how do they look like? It's not really important. So we can expect, I always say this, that evolution is basically a very frugal thing. It mostly will equip species with different kind of features, and the feature can be a cognitive capacity too, when it is really necessary. And meanwhile, every larger animal which is moving in the environment benefits highly from being aware where and what the body is doing, and actually how big is the body, for example. How the animal itself looks like is relatively not important for most of the species. And one more thing, I mean, mirror recognition for a dog, it's also a difficult problem, because for the dog and another dog which stares at it, what basically we see in the mirror, it can be frightening, or it can be kind of an agonistic image, and the dog cannot get to the level of thinking that, oh, how that looks like, but it rather thinks that why that dog is staring at me.
Yeah, indeed. And this takes us to how important, rather than the physical aspect for dogs, is the actions. And indeed, we have shown in a study, we will put links to the studies maybe below the video once we publish it. So if somebody is interested, we have some studies that are being published now about dogs being aware of their own bodies, of their own size, and of their own actions. So we will post links so that everybody can have a look at the studies if they are interested. And I will read this question that we have from Juan Pablo. Is asking, do you think we could speak of a scientific anthropomorphism as the cause of these methodological problems? Tricky question for you, Peter.
I think this is a very good question. I mean, I may even try to remember this scientific anthropomorphism. Thank you, Pablo. I mean, this is great. So exactly, I think this is a big problem which is infecting basically the thinking of many scientists, that we cannot make a distance between the human capacities, especially regarding cognition, and the research of animal cognition. So as I would like to express this, that usually comparative psychologists and those who do comparative ethology kind of try to find in the animals the possible most difficult and super developed capacities, what we can find in humans. And we are looking for these type of capacities in the animals. And this is not a good approach ecologically, because at first we should understand that why, for example, a human is adaptive to have this or that capacity. And then we should look for that whether this exact same capacity would be very useful for the animal. And most probably the answer will be no. So I love this approach, that scientific anthropomorphism, because we should try to avoid it. And we should try to think on the level of what would be ecologically useful for that other species, and then try to find evidence for that.
Indeed, I totally agree, but that was a good question. And yes, in science, I mean, especially ethology should really focus onto what is relevant for that species based on its environment, based on its evolution, and so on. And back to our body awareness, Peter, I would like you to describe a little bit what else have been done with dogs about them being aware of their body, how, for example, if they can represent their body as an obstacle in some situations.
As we talked about that you can represent how big is your body, also it's a basic question whether you are aware that you as a physical thing exist in the environment. And they figured out, the scientists who were researching it in human toddlers, I mean little infants, a very, I think a very smart way to test this. This is the body as an obstacle test. So originally they did it that little, like 2 years old toddlers were placed on a blanket, and simply the experimenter asked the child to hand over the blanket. And of course the kid already understood it and very happily tried to give the blanket to the researcher. But of course, as he or she was sitting on it, she could not do it. Now, after a particular age limit, the children realized that they can only hand over the blanket if they climb off from it. So this is the body as an obstacle paradigm. And later, the only known species, animal species, what this paradigm was used, it was Asian elephants. Obviously a much bigger version of the test. So the elephants were asked to hand over a piece of stick or something, or a slipper, whatever. These trained elephants could hand over objects with their trunk to the trainer. However, what the experimenters did, they tied the object with a rope to a big mat where the elephant was standing on. And what they found, that the elephants also realized that they cannot hand over the obstacle, I mean the target, when it was tied with the rope to the mat, because as they tried to lift it up, the rope pulled the mat, and they felt, the elephants have very sensitive feet, they felt that they are standing on the mat. Now, we thought that in dogs this could be a good paradigm, so we repeated this. We repeated this test with some additional groups to have better controls. So basically we needed dogs which were capable of picking up an object and give it to the owner into the hand. So this was the basic requirement. The dog should be able to perform this action on command. And those dogs which were able to do it, they were tested basically in the mini version of the elephant equipment. It was a little rug, and the dog was sitting on it and had to pick up the target, which was a kind of a rope, for example, and hand it over to the owner. And in one of the groups, the main test group, this target was tied with a string to the mat. But the other very important control group was that the target was tied to the ground with the anchor. So the dog could not see it, where is it tied, but it could not be lifted because it was anchored into the soil. And what we found, that basically dogs get off very quickly from the mat when they feel that the rope is pulling it under their feet. But when the removal of the target was not possible because it was anchored to the ground, the dogs kept standing on the carpet and tried to solve the problem. So what we found basically is the same capacity what was showed in children and also in the elephants, that the dogs can recognize when their own body is the obstacle of an action. And this is again a proof that dogs represent themselves as a physical existing something in their mental model about the environment. So it was a very, very nice and I think convincing experiment. I hope it will be published within a couple of weeks. Now it's under revision at a scientific journal. We will see how well it goes.
Well, yes, I'm sure it will be published soon, and we will make sure we spread the news also so that the people can read about it as well. And I think that this is another very important result in determining what building blocks of the ability to represent the self have evolved in dogs. And I would have a last question for you, Peter, before we say goodbye to our friends from all over the world. I would like to ask you, what do you think we should investigate in the future about dog self-representation?
There are plenty more building blocks, I think, what would be interesting to see, whether dogs have some kind of knowledge about themselves in other dimensions. I am very interested in, and we already worked on some protocols and testing opportunities. It's just, everywhere the coronavirus is a little bit in the way. But I would be very interested whether dogs can represent their own voice. Just to highlight the interesting aspect of this to the audience, surely everybody already noticed that when we hear ourselves from a recording, so our own voice played back, we realize that it totally sounds differently than how we usually hear this. This means that we have a representation, an imagination about how our own voice should sound. I would be very curious whether dogs have this capacity. Obviously not easy to test. And although I think that the mirror is not a very good method of testing dogs' visual self-representation, I have an idea how to test it, maybe with a little bit tricky way. I wouldn't use a mirror, but I would use a so-called video mirror. So I would probably project onto a canvas the dog's own action real time, and I would train the dog to do some little task always in front of this electric mirror. And when the dog was habituated to this situation, I would include a small, very small delay into the playback of the own action. So just imagine again, what would happen when you, for example, stare at the mirror because at the evening you are, for example, brushing your tooth, and suddenly you would notice that your mirror image is a little bit delayed. I think you would immediately go mental. You would freak out that something is not right. So I would like to see whether dogs who were habituated to their own mirror action would show some kind of surprise behavior if this action would be a little bit delayed. So this would be a kind of, I would say, virtual or electric mirror experiment. I would be really curious to this, for example, too.
Yeah, I find it a very interesting idea. And since we know that dogs are aware of their own actions, this would be a nice follow-up, I would say. So, yeah. I hope the COVID will not stop us in that.
Yeah.
Really? Yeah.
Maybe, Claudia, you can help in this.
Of course, I will.
Think about
Yeah, of course. Distance is not a problem. COVID won't be a problem. We got to go on, Peter.
Yeah.
Yes. So, well, I think that we should close our interview, Peter. I am really, really, really grateful. It was really interesting, and it was an honor to have you as our guest here. So thank you for accepting our
invitation. Nice. It was really nice, and I really enjoyed to be close basically to so many people who are all over the world. It's really, I think this is what science is about. This is what science about.
Indeed. So that's the idea behind these interviews, to bring science a little bit closer to non-scientists, but people that might still be interesting in the work we do. So that's exactly the aim, and I think you did a great job, Peter, on this, because you are an excellent scientist and also an excellent speaker. So thank you very much for coming. I thank everybody for your attention. And we will post the studies that are published. So there's one study about dogs being able to represent their own body size, and one study showing that dogs are able to represent and remember their own actions. And we will publish the link to the study. So if somebody is interested, you can have a look at all the details. And we will be here for eventually more questions if they will come up in comments. And otherwise, see you at the next appointment. Goodbye. Thank you, Peter, again.
Bye-bye. Thank you so much for the opportunity. Bye.